Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of St James Ethics Centre, AMP, the City of Sydney and the ABC, I'd like to welcome you all here this evening to the City Recital Hall, Angel Place, for the second debate in the 2012 series of IQ2 Australia Debates. And it's a topic which invokes strong arguments on both sides. Before proceeding, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land we meet tonight, to pay my personal respects to their elders and to any other Indigenous people in the audience. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director of St James Ethics Centre and I'm delighted to chair the debate tonight. I should mention to all of you in the audience that tonight's debate is being recorded by ABC Radio and Television for subsequent broadcast on Big Ideas. It'll also be podcast on the ABC sites at abc.net.au Big Ideas and also on the IQ2Oz site, which is www.iq2oz.com. And if you're interested in live tweeting, and I know a number of people do because the tweet sphere lights up when these debates are underway, then the hashtag to be used is hashtag IQ2Oz, IQ2OZ. A few basic rules for tonight. As you will know if you've attended before, we encourage really passionate discussion but respectful disagreement. So we ask this of our speakers on the panel, but also if you participate in the debate later on, as I hope you do, during the floor debate, we'd ask you to do so in the same spirit. To respect the intrinsic dignity of all of the people here in the hall and also on the stage. Before you entered, you would have been asked to express your opinion in a pre-debate poll. That will give us an indication of what you thought prior to hearing any arguments. What you'll be asked to do at the end, of course, is to vote, and behind each person's shoulder, if you haven't already found it, there is a voting ticket, very simple device, for and against. If you're undecided at the end of the debate when you're asked to cast your ballot, just leave it joined together and we'll take that as a vote of indecision. I hope that you'll be ready to vote though, yes or no, and you'll just tear and put either side in as appropriate. So the form for tonight's debate is as on the order paper. The topic is we've seen the energy future and it's nuclear. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers. You've got some indication about their background on the order paper. It's only a very light introduction to some remarkable individuals. And I'll introduce all of the speakers on the affirmative as a group and then all of the speakers on the negative. So for the affirmative, leading off is Ben Hurd, the founder of Think Climate Consulting and also of Decarbonise SA, an organisation within which he engages in his advocacy. He lectures on climate change at Adelaide University and was formerly opposed to nuclear power, but he now considers it to be an essential technology. He holds a master's degree in corporate environmental sustainability management and has presented to audiences across Australia. He's widely published in press and online, and his work on climate change was published for the 2011 ANZ-RAI conference. He's joined by Michael Angwin. Now, Michael's Chief Executive of the Australian Uranium Association. He was responsible for establishing the association, its decision-making processes, its agenda and its advocacy approach. His interest is in research-based advocacy, clarifying knowledge of the nuclear fuel cycle, on the need for the uranium industry to make known its best practice credentials. He's got quite an extensive background in business. He's been a senior executive with the Business Council of Australia and in the Commonwealth and Victorian Public Servants. He worked with Rio Tinto as their Chief Employee Relations Advisor and the principal of a consulting business. He's the co-author of several books on industrial relations reform and the author of many published articles and of many public addresses. And finally, joined by Professor Daniela Sterlik, Danny, a Professor of Sociology who was recently Foundation Director of the Northern Institute at Charles Darwin University up in the Northern Territory. She's an adjunct professor at James Cook University in Cairns and the Australian National University in Canberra, where I think she might be based at the moment. She was also a program director for the project Understanding the Formation of Attitudes to Nuclear Power in Australia for the National Academies Forum, work she undertook in 2009. Would you please join with me in welcoming the speakers for the affirmative? Leading the argument against the motion, we're very privileged to have with us, visiting from Tokyo in Japan, Dr. Fumihiko Yoshida. He's the Deputy Director of the Editorial Board of Japan's major daily newspaper, Asahi Shimbun. He's a co-writer of the recent Asahi Shimbun editorial series, Seeking a Society Without Nuclear Power. He's a graduate in American history from the University of Tokyo in 1980. He became a reporter for the Asahi Shimbun, Japan's leading national newspaper. He served as the paper's Washington correspondent and was later appointed chief of its Brussels News Bureau. He was a Master of Science in Foreign Service Fellow at Georgetown University in 1984 to 1985 and obtained his PhD in International Public Policy from Osaka University in 2007. Dr. Yoshida this year has been a visiting professor at Chuo University's Graduate School. He's written a number of books including Human Security Strategy and Nuclear America, from Truman to Obama. He's joined by Dominique Lafontaine, Vice President, Communications and External Affairs with Repower Australia, one of Australia's leading wind power companies and part of Global Wind Energy Corporation Suzlon. She's an authority on the opportunities and risks presented by climate change, clean energy and sustainability. Her previous roles include being the founding CEO of the Clean Energy Council, CEO of the Australian Wind Energy Association and Principal Climate Change with consulting engineers Pitt and Sherry. Dominique Lafontaine has a Bachelor of Applied Science, Environmental Assessment and Land Use Policy and is a board member of the New Zealand Wind Energy Association. And last but not least is an Australian who I think really needs no introduction, Professor Ian Lowe, AO, FTSE. He's Emeritus Professor of Science, Technology and Society at Griffith University, President of the Australian Conservation Foundation. His physics doctoral research was funded by the UK Atomic Energy Authority. He directed Australia's Commission for the Future in 1988, chaired the advisory council that produced the first independent report on the state of the Australian environment in 1996. Among many advisory roles, he's a member of the Radiation Health and Safety Advisory Council and the Queensland Sustainable Energy Advisory Council. Please welcome all of the speakers from the Netherlands. Ladies and gentlemen, the motion before this House is that we've seen the energy future and it's nuclear. I now invite the first speaker for the affirmative, Ben Hurd, to address the House.
Thank you very much. I first began looking into the future of energy a few years ago when I was doing a number of projects in climate change adaptation. Climate change adaptation being the process of looking at what we know and understand now about climate change and what's coming and trying to plan to meet that challenge. There are a few better ways of getting to understand the problem of climate change than working in adaptation. And what I learned in that process disturbed me quite greatly. We have at the moment and on our current pathway so much change coming down the pipeline that we are going to reach a point where the concept of adaptation ceases to apply. And instead we will start talking and thinking about concepts like survival and hanging on. And it concerned me to find more and more evidence that that point was probably approaching in this century that we're in now. At the same time, I was doing a number of projects in the mitigation space, being efforts to bring down those emissions to make that adaptation challenge more attainable. And I learned something equally concerning. In the suite of options that I was looking at, being renewable energies, energy efficiencies and carbon offsetting, without some extra major additional force to come in and help the effort, these solutions were not going to so much as touch the sides of meeting this problem. And this was deeply concerning to me. Renewable energies are growing very, very quickly, but from a very low base. Energy efficiency works and works well, but it's slow and incomplete and imperfect. Offsetting is a very good short-term strategy where a lot of good can be done, But currently our government is treating it like a long-term strategy out to 2050, and for a range of reasons that's destined to fail very badly. I needed to come back and look at an option that I hadn't permitted myself to see up to that point, which was nuclear power. I had never discussed nuclear power with my colleagues or my student peer group, except in anything other than fairly disparaging terms about why it wasn't required. In 3 years of doing a Masters of Sustainability at one of Australia's best universities, it was never discussed as a potential option for meeting the climate change challenge in Australia. I had to come back and take myself on a research journey about nuclear power to see whether or not it could meet that gap, and what I learned amazed me. I found out, first of all, that it is a zero-carbon power source, at least to the exact same extent that we regard renewable energy sources as a zero-carbon power source. This has been repeatedly assessed and demonstrated. I thought the opposite. I was wrong. The idea that nuclear power is high carbon across the life cycle is a false meme. I found, contrary to everything that I thought I knew, that nuclear power is the safest major energy source in the world. Again, this has been repeatedly assessed and demonstrated. The Energy-Related Severe Accident Database, maintained in Switzerland, looks at every accident across the whole energy chain of different energy sources, and it gives a clear finding. Nuclear is safer than coal, safer than oil, safer than gas, and safer than hydropower by a long margin. Major actuarial studies by the European Union give the same finding. Say what you like about actuaries, they're pretty unemotional in the way they do their work. They let the numbers do the talking, and the numbers talk very clearly and give that finding. I learned that ionising radiation is a hazard, but nothing like the hazard that I had believed it to be. And even in the context of a major accident that we have all been witness to, where a double natural catastrophe wallops ageing reactors and we have an unscheduled, unplanned release of radiation, the findings from the World Health Organization that have come in now are clear. The dose exposures for that accident are low, really low. And frankly, in terms of illness stakes and things that we have to worry about, no offence to ionising radiation, it just doesn't rate. Not alongside things like consuming too much red and processed meat, tobacco illness, or just boring old air pollution. Indoor air pollution, predominantly from cooking smoke, from those people too poor to afford electricity of any kind, claims 2 million lives every year, a lot of them children. Outdoor air pollution, from the combustion of fossil fuels predominantly, is responsible for 1.3 million deaths every year. If we want to make smart and intelligent choices on our energy and climate future, we have got to learn to measure our monsters and make sure we pay attention to the big ones. I didn't have an informed position on radiation. What I had more resembled a phobia. When I realised this about nuclear power, that it was clean in all sorts of ways, I realised we could have a future without air pollution. Nuclear power doesn't just emit no carbon dioxide, it emits no sulphur dioxide, nitric oxides, soot, heavy metals that fossil fuel emits run-of-the-mill, business as usual, every day. And what I saw most of all was the full-scale answer to that large-scale problem of climate change, an energy source that could replace coal, oil and gas. It has everything that we need from fossil fuels as an energy source, wholly reliable, wholly dispatchable, very portable, but without the pollution. What about spent nuclear fuel, you might say? Please understand and appreciate, waste is waste. Pollution is waste that is uncontained and in the environment, free to do damage to human health and the environment. Nuclear power plants produce a manageably small quantity of waste, which is then contained. Fossil fuel plants pollute, and they do that as business as usual, and we have all simply come to accept it. I know which of these two environments I would like to raise my two children in. It's the one without the pollution. And what's more, what is spent nuclear fuel? It is predominantly uranium, some plutonium and other actinides, and a very small amount of what's known as fission products. A completely different reactor design called the Integral Fast Reactor, which is paired with a reprocessing facility, can consume every atom of all of that uranium, all of that plutonium and actinide and give us zero carbon energy in return. This increases the energy output of mined uranium by 250 times. That means we have enough fuel sitting around in the form of depleted uranium and high-level spent fuel to power the entire world right now for centuries. That means potentially the end of energy mining if we want it. People like to tell me that the IFR isn't real. The IFR is real. At the World Energy Forum in Dubai this year, the integral fast reactor will be the focus of the nuclear energy discussion program. And if you visit Idaho, you can go to the Argonne National Laboratories, where the reactor was built, demonstrated, tested, and proven over a period of 10 years. When I really had a hard look at nuclear power, what I saw staring back at me were my own prejudices, my own biases, my blocks, my ignorance, and my indoctrination. What I see now potentially are two energy futures. One is more or less more of the same. Much more renewables, more nuclear, but a more or less unshaken dominance of fossil fuels. And in that future, I see the serious risk of a runaway climate in this century with serious impacts. Collapsing food supplies, wholesale loss of ecosystems, and dangerous sea level rise. Or I see an incredible future. A future without air pollution. A future where we are running on nuclear waste as fuel. A future where we have a fighting chance of winning back a stable climate. The difference between these two scenarios, less or more nuclear. More or less climate change. We have choices to make. I have seen this energy future, but it's going to take some creating. I hope I might have been able to convince some of you to do the creating with me. Thank you.
Dr. Yoshida.
Good evening. I'm very happy to be here with you to talk about nuclear issues. I'm a journalist, so by profession, I must be very objective on many things. But for tonight, let me speak on behalf of people whom I met in Fukushima and the people who are still suffering at Fukushima. Well, Fukushima was one of the biggest tragedies in our long history, 2,000 years history. And that accident triggered nuclear fuel meltdowns at 3 nuclear reactors. This is the first time in our history. And of course, it released huge amount of radiation, and the spread of radioactivities displaced as many as 100,000 people, and many of them still away from their hometown. And recently, the government said people cannot go back to their hometown, area around nearby nuclear power plant for decades, not months or years, for decades. About health issues, our government and the WHO recently said the risk of cancer is very low in the context of, in an epidemiological context. I'm not a specialist, but I can say about this one. But as a reality, mothers in Japan, they have strong worry about health of children, because children are more sensitive to radioactivities. Yes, of course, this cancer risk is a very important issue. But on top of that, maybe greater health risks may come from psychological stress. After Chernobyl accident, many people, many evacuees there have experienced so-called post-traumatic stress disorder. For short, it is called PTSD. And this PTSD risk may become even greater at Fukushima because people are more informed about risk of radiation. Let me introduce you one very sad story. Last July, last year, Mrs. Hamako Watanabe, she was 62 years old, killed herself. She was one of evacuees and suffered from overwhelming depression after evacuation. And finally, with a loss of hope, she put herself in kerosene and set herself on fire. As evacuees from Fukushima nuclear disaster, Mr. and Mrs. Watanabe lost almost everything: their homes, their jobs, their friends, and so on. Now, Mr. Watanabe, who lost her wife, says, if there was no nuclear accident, we wouldn't have gone through this kind of terrible thing. Evacuees like Mr. Watanabe say, government and the utilities are moving too slowly to restore the lives of impacted people. Mr. Watanabe said also that the lack of speed of policy is leading to social fallout like suicide. This is the reality in Fukushima and all the evacuees from Fukushima. Even outside the evacuation zone, there are plenty of problems. We still have a lot of problems about agriculture and fishing in the vicinity of Fukushima. Actually, fishermen and farmers cannot make product in the vicinity of Fukushima. Even the neighboring prefectures, they cannot work as before. So in that context, I think farmers and fishermen who are not displaced also are victims of the accident. As you see it already, Fukushima disaster seriously damaged human security of many people in Japan. That's what I feel. Well, having said that, what lessons should be learned from this nuclear disaster? The most important point, I think, is how much we can think the unthinkable to deal with nuclear potential risk. It was not impossible to prepare for big earthquake or tsunami. For example, some experts in Japan gave warnings to the government and the utilities about the possible big tsunami. But nevertheless, regulators in the government or the operators in the utilities didn't take this advice seriously because they thought those warnings were unproven. In other words, unthinkable. In Japan, we have so-called nuclear village, narrow-minded nuclear society. This nuclear village consists of politicians, bureaucrats, utilities people, and academics, which promoted nuclear industry's prosperity. Japan's nuclear village enjoyed their golden age right before March 11, 2011. Nuclear power provided about 30% of Japanese electricity. And the National Energy Policy 2 years ago called for that percentage to increase to 53% in the year of 2030. Under this luxury circumstance, Japan's nuclear village failed to make serious effort to prevent something unthinkable. For example, there are crucial vulnerabilities in the Fukushima reactor design and also weak management and loose regulatory supervision. We had that, but those negative things remained as the same before. It worked like inertia, political inertia. And finally, something unthinkable for the nuclear village took place in Fukushima. Well, human beings can make mistakes. So this is not only a case of Japan. Men and women in any country can make mistakes. So this is not the case, just a case of Japan. What I want to emphasize is we need to look at the serious reality in Japan. For human security reasons, I think we had better look ahead forward, phase out nuclear power plants. It is true in Japan, but also true globally, I think. I think this is a message from Fukushima. Thank you very much for your attention.
Michael Unwin.
Imagine what it must be like to be evacuated from your home because the government thinks there's too much radiation for it to be safe. Imagine what it's like to worry about the food you're eating and whether the radiation's affecting your kids. Imagine being told you could get cancer. Imagine you are stigmatised because you come from a place where there's been a nuclear accident. You would probably feel the sense of hopelessness from being constantly fearful. In those awful circumstances, you'd guess, rightly, that your mental health, if not your physical health, was being affected. You'd probably ask yourself, and any reasonable person observing your situation would ask themselves, what good does the nuclear industry do that justifies what happened to you? That's what the people of Fukushima no doubt ask themselves. I'm not here tonight to tell you that anything justifies their situation. But for all the concerns all of us have about the accident at Fukushima, nuclear power will continue to be part of the future. As any reasonable person would, I asked myself a number of questions in the wake of Fukushima. The first question I asked is, why do we have nuclear power in the world today? Nuclear power is a response to the world's economic growth aspirations. It became available as one of the answers to those aspirations in the second half of the 20th century. Those aspirations needed continuous, reliable supplies of electricity for large populations. Before nuclear, most of that came from coal and oil, but nuclear grew to become a major alternative source of supply, especially in the OECD. The USA is a classic case of a growing population which needed large-scale electricity supply, including nuclear power, to meet its aspirations to rising prosperity. France, where nuclear energy supplies the largest proportion of electricity of any country, is a case of a national consensus to build a nuclear industry to avoid energy insecurity in the wake of the first global oil crisis in the 1970s. Japan is a case of a country with few energy resources of its own, where creating large-scale electricity supply based partly on nuclear power was necessary to build a first world economy. Nuclear power is part of the world today because it helps make possible the historical drive towards prosperity and a decent way of life, and it is now embedded in the economies of many countries. The second question I pose to myself is, what does the future of electricity generation look like? All the major international organisations that think about this question answer it in much the same way. There will be a doubling of demand and supply of electricity by mid-century. There will be a decline in fossil-fuelled electricity across the board, and the decline will be both absolute and by share around the world. Hydroelectricity will decline by share across the board. Nuclear power will grow absolutely, will maintain its share in the OECD, and will increase its share in the non-OECD world. Non-hydro renewables, mostly wind, biomass and solar PV, solar panels on roofs, will grow absolutely and by share, and will be the principal growth sector. The future is in effect already written. The policies that will create this future are already in place, more or less. There will almost certainly be policy and technology innovations that will change this outlook in some ways, but none of the international organisations that think about this foresee a fundamental change in the outlook that I've outlined for you. Pretty much all forms of energy have a growth outlook, and only fossil fuels and hydro will decline. The future is a diverse energy portfolio, both shaped and constrained by economic, social, political and technological factors we already know largely about. Nuclear energy is already written into the future. The third question I asked myself is, why is this the future? Why will nuclear be part of it? Firstly, there will continue to be economic growth from two principal sources, from population growth and from the desire of people to be better off. More people means higher demand for electricity. The aspiration to prosperity will be a strong driver of economic growth, especially in Asia, where people want for themselves and for their children the kind of prosperity we have sitting comfortably here in Sydney, one of the richest cities in the world. And who is prepared to stand up and argue that they can't? So, not only more people, but more people with bigger ambitions and aspirations. Meeting those needs still requires continuous, reliable supplies of electricity. Nuclear power is one of the means for guaranteeing that supply within a diverse electricity generation portfolio. The second reason is that the world is also searching for clean energy supplies to address the problem of dangerous climate change. Taking into account all the activities involved in nuclear power, from mining, construction and electricity generation to decommissioning, the total greenhouse emissions from nuclear power are about the same or better than the total emissions from solar, geothermal, hydro and wind for the same electricity output. And of course, there are no emissions from electricity generation by nuclear power itself. So nuclear power is part of the future because it addresses the problem of dangerous climate change, something it has been doing for over 50 years. That still leaves me with a justification to the people of Fukushima. Would my questions and answers persuade or satisfy them? I doubt it. The tension between their personal circumstances and the case for nuclear power is real and strong and won't be reconciled by cold, hard fact. There will be some in this audience for whom the cold, hard facts are compelling, who will require nothing more to justify nuclear power. There will be some for whom no array of facts will ever be enough. Yet I suspect, with no surprise at all, that the tension felt in Fukushima is shared, more or less, by a majority of people in this room. To be more or less fearful, more or less negative about nuclear energy in light of Fukushima is quite rational, quite understandable. To those people I say this: trust in the nuclear industry has been damaged, and restoring it will require the nuclear industry to perform better and behave differently. The nuclear industry will have to show convincingly that it can live up to the expectations of people like those in this room. The industry is more self-critical and self-correcting than you probably think, and knows the challenges ahead of it. I have seen the future, and it is this. Not all countries will choose nuclear power. Not all countries will keep their nuclear power industries. But the future is already largely written, and it is one in which the nuclear industry has a continuing role in a diverse global portfolio of electricity generating technologies. Thank you.
Dominic Lafontaine.
Good evening. I've seen the energy future, and it is one in which electricity, indeed all energy, is generated safely and cleanly and is used conservatively and intelligently, and predominantly generated by renewable resources in a much more integrated, complex way that relies much more on distributed generation than it does today. In the future, the human race will know that to sustain this planet, the one on which we derive our entire well-being, we must only use safe, low-emission, clean energy technologies. Nuclear may be available, but it is not inevitable. It's very evident that as renewables become better understood, that prospects for renewables become more optimistic and accepted by the mainstream as energy efficiency measures, innovation and behaviours make real headway in reducing the amount of energy we use. As the utilisation of gas ramps up markedly around the world, and with the reality that the risks that the utilisation of nuclear presents are just too significant, I argue that the energy future is by no means a nuclear one. Now, to state the case that the future will be one with an ever-declining role for nuclear energy, clearly one of the most important points to make is that there are safer and cleaner technologies that today and in the future reliably produce electricity, and that these can be used in place of nuclear. And to help make this argument, I want to share with you something that's much more substantial than a crystal ball. I will share with you a number of prognoses from the world's future energy outlook. Prognoses from organisations that range from conservative in their viewpoint to ones that could be considered more progressive. Importantly and conclusively, none of these count on a substantial role for nuclear around the globe. Let me start with the International Energy Agency and the future projections it has made for energy supply. Now, this is an organisation that has traditionally espoused the importance of nuclear and fossil fuels. In fact, when I first started working in the wind energy industry, knowing the extent to which wind energy companies themselves had such confidence in wind energy, it surprised me how reticent the International Energy Agency was about renewables. Indeed, the Global Wind Energy Council was formed in part to present an alternative picture to that which the IEA was espousing. But back in 2007, it became evident that the IEA started to take climate change and low-carbon pathways very seriously. The organisation started to focus on energy efficiency in a much more prominent way, and also started to become more assertive about the opportunity for renewables. And most recently, Maria van der Hoeven, the Executive Director of the International Energy Agency, wrote that today wind, solar, hydro and other forms of renewable energy account for almost 1/5 of all electricity produced worldwide, and that the IEA sees that share expanding to at least 32% by 2035. And together with natural gas, renewables will meet almost 2/3 of incremental energy demand in the period of 2010 to 2035. In its Energy Technology Perspectives 2012, Pathways to a Clean Energy System, the IEA looks at emission reduction targets that will give us the best chance to limiting long-term global temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius. The IEA scenario says that renewables need to provide 57% of power by 2050. The report finds that the more mature renewables, including hydro, biomass, onshore wind and solar photovoltaics, are making sufficient progress. But it is concerned that other key technologies such as energy efficiency technologies, carbon capture and storage, and to some extent offshore wind and concentrated solar power do need to scale up significantly. And while the utilisation of nuclear does increase, the IEA says that deployment will remain below levels required to achieve a 2 degrees scenario. The IEA also says that natural gas can enhance security of supply and global resources exceed 250 years of current production, while in each region gas resources exceed 75 years of current consumption. And yes, to support renewables growth, subsidies are necessary, and these do need to rise, although the subsidy cost per unit output is expected to decline and there will be lasting energy security and environmental benefits. And of course, many argue that the best way to achieve a level playing field for renewables with conventional fuels is to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. And according to the IEA, currently about $630 billion are spent on fossil fuel subsidies every year, whereas only $65 billion go into renewable energy support. Now let's turn to a couple of corporate energy giants to hear what they say. In its energy outlook to 2030, BP presents a future that sees little growth in total energy consumption in the OECD countries, but forecasts a significant shift in fuel mix away from nuclear. Renewables take the place of oil in transport. Renewables and gas take the role of coal in power generation. The economic development in non-OECD countries means that all fuels do need to expand to meet the huge energy demands, but nuclear does not become a dominant energy source. And for many developing countries, of course, the imperative remains securing affordable energy to underpin economic development. But BP says that renewables on their own contribute more to world energy growth than oil. The largest single fuel contribution comes from gas, which meets 31% of projected growth in total energy. ExxonMobil sees the energy mix out to 2040 evolving so that wind, solar, geothermal, biomass and biofuels and hydro growing nearly at 8% per annum, and nuclear only at 2.2% per annum. Interestingly, employment studies are also forecasting a diminished role for nuclear energy. The European Trade Union Confederation in 2009 modelled future trends in European electricity generation. It found that while employment in renewables and gas expanded over the period of 2010 to 2030, jobs in the nuclear sectors reduced. And recently, the International Labour Organization said that the move towards solar and other renewables also promised substantial occupational health benefits. And while there are safety issues, they are manageable and none are out of the ordinary of an industrial setting. But can renewables actually support economic development? While people generally accept the role of gas and the gains to be made by energy efficiency are obvious, there remains a strong perception that renewables will not be able to provide reliable enough electricity to depend upon. They point to this ability to provide baseload as a key reason to champion nuclear energy. This is a misguided perception. A plan to power 100% of the planet with renewables by Jacobson and DeLucci, a study published in the Scientific American, argues that the world has sufficient resources of wind, water and solar, and that it is indeed feasible to transform the world's energy systems so that it is powered only by renewable resources. And in two of the countries that are rethinking their nuclear ambitions, changes are afoot as government and business refocus exploiting renewable resources. In Germany, the future of nuclear is over and legislation has been passed to phase out nuclear energy by 2022. Renewables will provide 35% of energy by 2022 and the country has an 80% renewable energy target. In Japan, the Toshiba Corporation and the tsunami-wrecked city of Minamisoma have agreed to build a gigantic solar plants at a cost of 30 billion yen to assist in the recovery of the disasters.
Professor Danny Sterling.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to bring us back home a little and talk about Australia's energy future as not being written in stone, but being created by all the decisions that we're taking here and now. This is a very historic time in Australia's present, as we're making decisions today that will impact on our future and those Australians who come after us. I suggest that we will be remembered as the generation that in our insatiable hunger for energy to feed our lifestyles, made choices that are having a profound impact in writing Australia's future. I also suggest that we're making those choices by default. We are, in fact, leaving the decision-making to others. Australians continue to live in a world of paradoxes, perhaps a world a little bit like Alice in Wonderland. 3 examples for you of these paradoxes. First of all, despite being a nation that has a global reputation for a rapid take-up of new technologies, such as mobile phones, when it comes to how we make our energy, we seem quite comfortable with remaining stuck in the 19th century and live with the consequences. Secondly, when we have a choice between farmland and energy, we choose energy. As a consequence, we're destroying some of Australia's best and most productive soil in our demand for energy. Where are we going to grow our food? Thirdly, while we seem quite sanguine about allowing our uranium to be sold overseas and used by others, we deliberately avoid these important resources to support our own energy demands. So my question to you all tonight is, given that we all appreciate the seriousness of these issues, why then do we as a nation avoid the discussion, or even more worryingly, give over the discussion to our politicians? Why indeed? I suggest that it's because of our national addiction to cheap coal. Our lifestyle here in Australia, a lifestyle fuelled by access to cheap coal, has become hungrier and hungrier for cheaper and cheaper energy. For a moment, I want you all to imagine an Australia without our coal resources. Yes, it's really hard to do that. We have become so complacent that coal just appears to be there to fuel our hunger. This has given us permission as a nation to avoid or even ignore the difficult conversation we must have about a future that needs to include nuclear energy as an option. Nuclear energy is just not salient to us all as Australians. What do I mean by salient? I mean that it just isn't important. It isn't relevant, and that's because of our addiction to coal. We are therefore ignoring the very important national conversation that should be happening all around us. Do we seriously think that wind and solar will feed all of our demands? Current evidence shows that it cannot meet our increasing demands for continuous, reliable electricity supply. Only a week ago, the Sydney Morning Herald article made it very clear that we will also not be able to rely on carbon capture and storage technology to solve the coal carbon challenge. That technology won't save us, as even if it does work, which is an unknown as yet, it will be at a great cost. And yet, while we read these articles, in our paradoxical relationship with energy, we ignore these facts. We ignore them at our peril. Our lack of involvement in these discussions and this decision-making means the future is being written for us. Research I undertook in 2009 highlighted that while the adoption of new technologies, such as nuclear power, needs to be considered within a political agenda, it should not be left simply to the politicians to decide for or against. Geographically, we can see just how access to cheap coal has shaped the way in which our nation has grown and our cities have grown. It's one of the reasons why we all tend to cling to coastlines. This population growth puts an increasing pressure on the demands for energy. Historically, Australia considered the matter of cheap electricity as being part of its nation building. Consider, for example, the Snowy Mountain Scheme. The demand for cheap energy to fuel nation building reached its zenith in 1969 with a feasibility study to build a nuclear power plant on the coast south of Sydney. This was then a political decision. The fact that the plans were subsequently abandoned was a further political decision. Over the past 40 years, we have surrendered our voices in the discussion about Australia's energy future, and we've left it to our politicians to make these decisions for us. In what other important national issue have we done this? I can't think of any. Why do we hand this over to the politicians? This gives them permission to make the issue not just a political one, but also an ideological and emotional one. If we did a straw poll here today, we could probably name all those politicians for and against in this debate. It's now a well-rehearsed argument. It becomes a performance, one to which we have all stopped listening. So let's start listening, and let's recognise that the issue must be a salient one for each and every one of us. We cannot continue to remain addicted to coal. We all know that. So we need to accept responsibility to participate in and take charge of this important discussion. Research conducted in 2008-09 by CSIRO showed that when Australians have all the necessary facts about where and how our energy is currently drawn, and are within an environment which is conducive to thinking and reflecting, and have all the information about risks and hazards and costs, financial and health, about various energy alternatives, then they do, soberly and without emotion, consider the issues associated with nuclear energy and go on to make informed decisions. And by facts here, I mean the risks and compromises that all forms of energy, coal, gas, renewables, as well as nuclear, mean. These facts are already known. We don't need new research, but we do need an education program outside of a political and cultural pressure that will enable us to make these important decisions for a sustainable future. As an educator, I strongly call for an informed national conversation based on facts and not on emotion. This will then enable us all to help shape our future. Thank you.
Professor Ian Lowe.
Thank you, Chairman. Those on the other side have said several things that I agree with and some that I don't. You'll pardon me if I spend most of my time focusing on what I don't. Ben Herd said climate change is a critical threat, and I agree totally. But he then said efficiency and renewables won't touch the sides. And of course, if efficiency and renewables cannot reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, then we have to consider nuclear power. But I draw him to the attention to the data. Not even the worst enemies of John Howard would consider him a wild-eyed green zealot. But his government released in 2003 the National Framework for Energy Efficiency that said efficiency measures using proven technology could reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by 30% with measures that have a payback time of 4 years or less. Now, I call that touching the sides. In fact, I call that cutting a great chunk out of the sides. A 30% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions within 4 years, cost-effectively providing economic benefits as well as environmental benefits. He said that in 3 years studying sustainability, nuclear energy was not mentioned, and he wondered why. Well, it seems to me there's a fundamental reason why, which is that nuclear energy breaches one of the fundamental principles of sustainability, intergenerational equity. because it places burdens on future generations to satisfy our wish in the short term for reliable energy. Nuclear could replace coal, oil and gas, but only in a future in which human rights would have to be subjugated to safeguard the phenomenal amount of fissile material that would be in circulation. He saw only two futures: continued use of fossil fuel, or what he called an incredible future of nuclear power. And I think technically that is correct. I think that future is incredible. At least I don't find it credible. And of course there is a third future, that of renewables. And I will sum up the argument for why the renewables future is preferable. Finally, he suggested we should rely on the integral fast reactor. The new generation of reactors which will solve all our problems is what I think is the perpetual delusion of the nuclear industry. I've been involved in looking at nuclear energy for more than 40 years, and throughout all of that time we have consistently been assured that a new generation of reactors is on the drawing board that will be cleaner, cheaper, safer and not have the problems of the existing ones. Now, just because people have been consistently wrong for 40 years doesn't mean they'll always be wrong, but it does mean that their assurances should be taken with at least a shovelful of salt. Michael, I think, redefined the topic. The topic that I saw was, I've seen the energy future and it's nuclear. He seems to have redefined it to, I've seen the energy future and there might be a small role for nuclear somewhere at the corners. Because what he described was a future in which the heavy lifting is done by renewables, but there is a small residual component of nuclear energy. In fact, the International Energy Agency has studied several future low-carbon scenarios in which by 2050 we decarbonise electricity supply. Some of those explicitly excluded nuclear because not all countries believe it should be part of the solution. But even those scenarios which did include nuclear concluded it typically accounts for about 6% of the low-carbon electricity supply of 2050. He also, I think, rewrote history by saying nuclear power developed as a response to our aspirations. The first commercial nuclear power station was Calder Hall in the UK, and its commercial generation of electricity was a public relations stunt to distract attention from the fact that the real purpose of Calder Hall was to produce plutonium for the British bomb. Daniela said, and I agree with most of what she said, our energy future will be determined by our decisions, and that's entirely correct. The future is not somewhere we're going, it's something we're creating by our decisions. Short-sighted decisions to destroy cropland for cheap energy make no sense. We have a national addiction to cheap coal, and that's obviously true. Witness the hysterical reaction to a modest charge on carbon dioxide emissions and the continued repetition of the barefaced lie that this will be the world's biggest carbon tax. I spent 5 minutes on the web and I found that Sweden and Norway introduced carbon charges of more like $100 a tonne 20 years ago. So to say that $23 a tonne in 2012 prices is the world's biggest carbon tax is an exaggeration of which any politician should be proud. And obviously they are, because they keep saying it. She said carbon capture and storage cannot be trusted, and I think that's clearly true, that even if it were proven, to capture and store the carbon dioxide emissions from the existing coal-fired power stations would require transporting and storing a volume of liquids equivalent to the entire current oil and gas industry, starting from a position of no infrastructure. And finally, she said that decisions should be not be left to the politicians. And again, that is something the Ranger Uranium Inquiry said 35 years ago, that politicians have a role, but the decisions about which technologies we use should be those for the community as a whole. And I believe that's entirely right, that we should, as a community, be making informed decisions about what energy sources we use. But Daniela then concluded that we need an education program that will allow us to make informed choices. Now, I worry when people say we need education, because education is one of those irregular verbs. I educate, he propagandises, they brainwash. When people say they want an education program, what they usually mean is they want a program that will persuade us that they are right and we historically have been wrong. It's quite common among the scientific and technical community to believe that they understand the technologies like nuclear power and genetic modification, and if only you, the great unwashed, could be brought to their level of galactic understanding, you would see the point as well. I remind people of what's been called the May effect. One of Australia's most distinguished scientists, Lord Robert May, pointed out to the UNESCO World Congress on Science that educating people about complex technologies like nuclear energy or genetic modification of crops does not actually make them more sympathetic to the implementation of those technologies. In fact, he said, there is a tendency for more educated communities to be more hostile. And he believes the reason is that only the uneducated and the uninformed believe the assurances that you will have benefits without costs. And he said the more aware you are of the science, the more sceptical you are of the assurances that you can have all the benefits with none of the costs. The fundamental point is that we are discussing the issue because of the science of climate change, because no rational person without a financial interest or an ideological axe to grind would consider nuclear energy for Australia unless they accepted that climate change was a serious problem. I exclude for the moment people like those who write editorials for our national daily newspaper, who seem to be able to think that climate change is so trivial we can safely treble our coal exports, but so serious we should build nuclear power stations. But I remind you that 50 years ago, nuclear power was promoted as clean, cheap and safe. It's now widely seen as expensive, dirty and dangerous. The two fundamental problems identified by the Ranger Inquiry, radioactive waste management and the prevention of weapons proliferation, remain unsolved 35 years later. There is a clean energy future. 20 years ago, the Department of Resources and Energy said that we could get all our energy from renewables by 2030. Last year, Beyond Zero Emissions said we could get it by 2020. Last year in Australia, with no fuss, no protests, no nonsense in the media, 837 megawatts of solar power was installed in Australia by individuals and small companies. That's equivalent to the output of a large nuclear power station, and it was done cleanly, quietly and effectively. I've seen the future. It's large deployment of small-scale renewables. It's the clean energy future that we should all support.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard 6 very different speeches on this topic, and it's now your opportunity to contribute to the debate. What I will do, to be fair, is provide in order for and against, if there are speakers for or against, so that both sides are represented. But before I do, I just wanted to note one thing, Dr Yoshida. I thought it was very moving what you had to say about the personal experience of people in Japan after the disaster that befell them. And I think I speak for everybody here in Australia about the great admiration we all had for the response of your country to such terrible tragedy. I just wanted to note, even this long after, how much admiration there was in Australia for Japan and its people. Now remember, we're going for and against, so if you're speaking on the for side, that means you believe that the energy future is nuclear. Against, you have a different view. Anybody wants to speak for the motion, in favour of nuclear? Yes, so you get precedence. Start there. Microphone 1. And if I just ask if you could give your name, then you have a minute to speak.
Okay, my name's Gurunwi Price. I'd particularly like to ask Professor Lowe. He admitted in his talk that nuclear does work, that you can eliminate greenhouse emissions, you can power by nuclear. If you were running Japan now, if you weren't an academic but you were a politician and you were in charge of Japan, would you shut the nuclear power stations, or would you replace them with gas or would you introduce some sort of renewable scheme? In other words, because what Japan is going to do, it's not going to replace the nuclear plants it's closing with nuclear, it's going to replace them with gas. Which is the greater risk? The increase in carbon emissions from thermal power, or the risk of nuclear power? Because that's the real choice. The time it takes to implement renewables is just too long.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll take that on notice to you, Ian. Again, we'll go microphone one. You wanted to speak against the motion, is that right?
Yes.
Your name and then a minute.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay, Richard Brunowski, against the motion. On my way in here tonight, I was waylaid by an acquaintance who suggested that more people choke from eating asparagus as have problems with radiation sickness. I want to say to Dr. Yoshida, I'm very pleased to meet you and to hear what you have to say, and you've not mentioned one of the most important problems. Let's hope it doesn't happen at Fukushima, where the cooling pool of reactor number 4, absolutely full of nuclear fuel, is balanced and teetering and has already distortions at its side. If that goes, nuclear experts in Japan, government experts have said Tokyo will be in danger. Let's hope that doesn't happen. But let me say also that Japan has an opportunity now, like Germany, and Japan has enormous technology and is still the third most powerful economy in the world, to take a right-angled turn and go into renewables, and I can see this happening. I can see this right along the north coast of Honshu, and I can see it with entrepreneurs in Japan.
Thank you.
That will be a good example.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've had two comments and questions about Japan. I think this is a very frightening thought perhaps for the Japanese, but Ian, if you were the Prime Minister of Japan and you were afraid, I don't want to wish that upon them, but if you had to make the choices, how would you decide, and what do you think is the lesser evil, as you were asked?
That's a very good question. I remember a cartoon that showed a politician saying, that's a really serious question that demands sophisticated evasion.
Try and resist.
I don't think there is a simple answer. Again, the wise American H.L. Mencken said, every complex question always has a simple answer and it's always wrong. I don't think there is a simple answer, and if I were going to say what I thought should be done for energy supply in Japan, I'd want to be a lot better informed than I am, and probably a lot better informed than the decision makers in Japan are either, to judge from what I've seen. But I want to commend Richard Brunowski's forthcoming book, Fallout from Fukushima, which I think should be on everyone's reading list.
I think it may be an ad, but you can do it.
I think you should stop that.
We'll come back to you in a moment.
It's an ad.
And in terms of Japan at the moment is functioning without its nuclear reactors, and there appears to be widespread public opposition to restarting them. I think the example of Australia shows that if you're serious about it, you can install renewables very quickly. And you can certainly install renewables much faster than you can build new nuclear capacity. As I said, we installed last year, in 1 year, an amount of solar energy that's equivalent to a large nuclear power station, which would have taken 15 years to build. Okay. So I think if I were in Japan, I would be saying, let's go for a clean energy future rather than repeating the mistake of the past.
So I have to speak to that.
Yeah, okay, yeah, you might want to.
There is at least one simple answer on Japan, and here it is. Japan is the world's 5th highest emitter of greenhouse gases. Most of their greenhouse gases come from the electricity sector, and over the last 20 years, thankfully, Japan is one of the few countries whose emissions from the electricity sector have not risen. Japan's emissions from the electricity sector have been very high, but basically flat for 20 years, until now, and they are now climbing, and climbing very swiftly for exactly the reason that the other gentleman said. There is simply no way of shutting down nuclear baseload and replacing it in a flash with renewables. It is being replaced with large quantities of fossil fuel, and that is going to continue to happen and happen and happen, and it is hammering Japan's balance of trade, and it is sending their emissions skyward. If we are okay with that, okay, but that is the consequence of shutting nuclear in Japan. Don't make any mistake. There is some simple answers available on this issue, provided we just attend to simple data.
Michael?
I think Professor Lowe's point about the time it takes to build nuclear power plants misses actually two quite important points. One is that you can't just click your fingers like that and have a renewable energy technology across the world supplying all the electricity that we could possibly want forever. The second thing is there are 400 operating nuclear power plants in the world today already avoiding greenhouse gases, and without them we'd be in a much more difficult situation on the climate than we already are. And he wants to close those down. So, look, frankly...
Well, does he? Do you want to close down all of the world's nuclear reactors? Was that to misrepresent your position?
That's a misrepresentation. I didn't say that. I mean, what I have said is that the world should gradually increase its renewables. I didn't say we should close down existing. There's even a case that we should maintain some of the gas-fired power stations for the time it takes to build renewables.
Well, I mean, there you have it again. I mean, that's the decision that's being faced. Gas. I mean, gas is the shadow lurking in all of these renewable visions. As soon as you dig underneath the surface, these renewable visions are gas visions. And may I say, 837 megawatts of solar PV does not equate to a large nuclear power plant. At a capacity factor of about 20%, that's 208 megawatts happening when the sun shines in a year. That's not a nuclear power plant. A nuclear power plant provides baseload. There are some simple answers, provided you understand simple concepts of how we actually derive our energy right now. That's false.
Simon, I wonder if I could just add...
and then we'll come back to the audience.
I just want to add a kind of personal but also social aspect to Japan and what it's facing this summer. Having lived there for some years and lived through both summers and winters, people rely on electricity to give them the capacity to live comfortably in the summer. And so the demand for energy in the Osaka-Kansai area, where they'll have brownouts. And the accommodation, the houses that people live in are not open, there's not a lot of airflow. And so what we're going to see is in this tragedy, we'll see ongoing demand for electricity, which will make governments have to make decisions. Because when it becomes social, when it becomes personal, when it becomes a health issue, governments are forced to make decisions, and we will see those decisions made over this summer.
Okay, we're moving back to the audience. Somebody who'd like to speak for the motion? Yes, microphone one, and then we'll get a few against. Yes.
My name is Gary Greenhalgh. My question is to you, Ben. I am for nuclear power if and only if the nuclear waste problem can be resolved. You mentioned new generation reactors. I thought you were talking about thorium-based reactors. If that's the case, my understanding is that is in a very early stage of research and development. Is it possible to build a reactor in the next 10 years which can get rid of all the waste available now and the waste not to be used for nuclear weapons?
Thank you. What an excellent question.
Hang on to that. You can come back to it in a moment. It's like doing pantomime. You're against the motion, is that right? Microphone two.
Thank you.
Your name?
Nuclear energy may well be cleaner and safer than fossil fuels, depending on which statistics you choose to use and the basis you use. But is nuclear cleaner, safer and cheaper than renewable energy, demand-side management or energy efficiency? It's certainly quicker, energy efficiency I mean. You could institute new product standards and get them rolled out far quicker than the 10 to 15 years it would take to build a nuclear power plant. McKinsey a few years ago estimated you could save 100 megatons of carbon, which is roughly a sixth of Australia's usage, cost negatively. That it'd save us money as well as saving carbon. That's touching the sides there as well, to use that phrase. And all of that could be done on a progressive basis by the market without requiring government intervention, without which almost no nuclear power plant in the world has been built. Would you address those, please?
Okay. Feel free to clap if you'd like something in the audience. Is anybody wants to speak for the motion? Yep, okay, microphone one, and then we'll go upstairs for one against. Yep, microphone one.
Hi, my name's Martin Clophley. I studied electrical engineering and I did my thesis on distributed generation. Based on my research, I found that you can't use renewable energy as a base load. It's inherently capped at about 30% due to the inherent variability in renewables. The against side seem to say that you can use renewable energies. That's their vision for the future. My question is, what is your belief based on, and why is that a credible source to base your belief on?
Okay, thank you. And speaking against the motion at microphone 3.
Dermot Duncan, just some clarifications. I thought I'm a member of the Rec Agents Association, and we published a report last week on the impact of cost of renewable energy, and it's had about a 1.8% reduction in actual electricity consumption. It's also produced around about 1.5 gigawatts of energy, so it's displaced that. So that is I imagine, a nuclear energy facility. And also, I think from the gas perspective, ABARE actually estimate there's only 68 years of discovered gas in Australia. So if we're going to go down the gas route, we need to discover that gas. And also renewable energy, we can mix different forms of renewable energy because they have different levels of intermittency. So, you know, the various reports are we can use wind, hydro, and tidal as well as solar thermal. So thanks.
Thanks. Well, look, Ben, first of all, I know you're raring to answer this question about the creation of reactors that are actually capable of performing as you've said.
Yep.
Were you talking about thorium? Were you talking about fast breeder?
No.
Can they be built and proven within 10 years?
The gentleman's correct. I was not talking about thorium reactors. That is a different type of technology, and it is in a much earlier stage of development. The technology that I'm referring to is called the integral fast reactor. It is surprisingly not new. Fast reactor, as Ian is correct, have actually been thought of and progressively developed for about as long as nuclear has been around. The integral fast reactor was perfected between 84 and 94 at the Argonne National Laboratories. It's a uranium-based technology. GE Hitachi right now are petitioning the UK government to build a 300 megawatt reactor called a PRISM, which is the reactor half of the technology, in order to dispose of and downgrade their stockpile of separated plutonium. So that is their proposed solution to get rid of that waste pile. Now, were that paired with a pyroprocessing facility to enable that plutonium to cycle through many times rather than just once, that is the basic concept of an integral fast reactor. The fuel is a metal fuel which can be easily melted, the impurities are removed, reformed into metal fuel, and it can be run through again. It does work, and if GE Hitachi have their way, it will be operational within 10 years. They have even said we won't charge for it, we will just make money per unit of electricity sold and per unit of plutonium disposed of. That's how good the deal is, that's how confident they are.
Dominique, the challenge for your side is that the claims about providing baseload sustainable power from renewables is not valid, and the challenge was on what evidence do you make that claim?
It's interesting also to me, just in addition to that, this position that renewables can't be deployed quickly. In fact, that is one of the great characteristics of renewables, particularly the likes of wind and solar, that actually they're quite modular and they can be rolled out quite quickly. And if we look at South Australia, only, I think 5 or 7 years ago, we hardly had any wind energy. In 2010, we had 18%. And last year we had 26% of electricity coming from wind, so we've seen remarkable growth there. But to the point of baseload and variability of renewables, yes, renewables do have a natural variability, but the people who work in this space are very clear, and we can see this already in Australia, that if we have geographically dispersed renewables, that we have distributed generation, so we're moving away from the large-scale generation that we've been used to having as part of our energy systems, that we have smart forecasting technologies, which we do have here in Australia. We're leading the world in some of that work, and that also we actually change the way that we use electricity. Our electricity use has grown up around a large-scale thermal plant, and indeed one of the negatives of nuclear, it's not a peaking generation. So what we have to do is look at the way we are using energy and change the way we use energy, and in fact there is a number of studies that say that we can do that.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple more people from the floor before we run out of time. So speaking for the motion, microphone 1.
My name is Dr. Stuart Nettleton, and I'm from UTS, and I spent many of my working years in the electrical industry before becoming an academic, and I spent a lot of time in transmission. And I would like to speak for the affirmative case. My PhD was on climate change. But in terms of questioning geographically distributed renewable energy, it's a very nice in concept, but we are about to see the construction of a network of 1 million volt high voltage DC transmission lines, maybe less, maybe 750 kV, in order to bring these geographically diverse renewables to the cities, which are concentrated load centres, which large 1 or 2 gigawatt plants of coal or nuclear supply fairly readily through the system right now. So the question is, aren't we about to see another large scale investment and another large source of environmental pollution in terms of the network to bring the renewables?
Thank you. Yeah. Speaking against the motion, microphone 2.
Penelope McNulty. Professor Stellick said we have to make power supply personal. I would have solar energy in my backyard. I would have wind supply. I wouldn't have coal or gas, and I most certainly wouldn't have nuclear.
Thank you. Speaking for the motion, I suspect Martin Thomas, yes?
How interesting.
Thank you, Chairman. Martin Thomas is the name. A few points. Firstly, I think I agree with almost everything that every speaker said.
Your vote will be an interesting one, Martin.
With 1 or 2 exceptions. Firstly, and Ian, I hope you'll forgive me if I address you, because we're old friends. We've spoken on the same platform frequently about energy efficiency. The low-hanging fruit, absolutely 100% with you, and I think every thinking person is. Unfortunately, our business managers do not seem to pick it up because it's low-threshold investment. But it is investment, and I think our Academy, of which we're both fellows, will work on that. You omitted to mention the Switkowski report of 2006, which was initiated by the same government as you just mentioned, which was suppressed when the government changed, but can now be found on the Australian Archives record if you happen to dial in the magic words UMPNA. Australia will be going to 100 gigawatts by 2050, roughly. 80% carbon reduction is what our governments both have committed to, and many other governments. I see the future, all of you, as a mix, a portfolio of many low-emission technologies, of which uranium is one, and I think economics will determine the balance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And speaking, you're across the 2. Okay, so it's a good finish. So microphone 1, yeah.
I've got a question. My name's Kate Levy. I've got a question across both teams. Australia survived the financial crisis by good banking regulation. If both panels see that nuclear is a component of the future, how do they see the regulation bodies to continue? Is it going to be like the IEA? How do you govern and control weapons grade? Do we have the drama of a North Korea emerging every decade? That's my sort of question.
Thank you. And there'll have to be the final person now, microphone 2, your name?
John Morgan. Question to those against. Given that the rate at which we decarbonise will determine how much warming the planet ultimately experiences, and given that we can decarbonise more rapidly if we use both renewables and nuclear power, how many degrees of planetary warming do you feel it's worth to avoid the use of nuclear energy?
Okay, thank you. Well, look, how many degrees of planetary warming? So we're coming back, we're finishing off with the last comment come question about this trade-off, which I know you delicately sought to avoid, between global warming and involvement in nuclear. What's going to happen now is that I'm going to ask each of the speakers to spend around 2 minutes responding to comments or questions or introducing final summing ups, and I think hopefully you've captured the flavour of what was asked. At the same time, you're going to be invited to vote. Remember, you should all have now, either behind your shoulder or in your hand, a voting slip. If you're undecided still, then leave it joined together and put it in. But if you've made your decision for or against, please cast the half you tear accordingly. So we're going to start with you, Ben, and your final 2 minutes responding to the comments and any final comments you want to make.
Okay. If renewable energy technologies and energy efficiency is so great, why the hell are we failing so badly? On every conceivable metric of climate change, we are failing miserably. More energy, more emissions worldwide. We're losing, guys, we're losing. We need everything that we can get. I'd like to speak quickly to energy efficiency because that's a large part of what I do in my actual job when I'm not talking about nuclear power. Energy efficiency does work, but there is an enormous difference between what you can show and demonstrate as achievable in an engineering study and what you can actually get achieved on the ground with an organisation and a group of decision makers, where energy efficiency is distributed across hundreds of thousands of locations, pieces of equipment, decision-making units. There are miles and miles of daylight of difference between those two concepts, what is conceptually achievable and what is actually deliverable. Young gentleman asked me about whether or not it's as safe as renewables. That's like asking whether or not I prefer bicycles or trucks. Frankly, I prefer bicycles, but when I moved house, I didn't strap 40 bicycles together. They do a different job. They do a different job. Danielle mentioned gas 6 times. Dominique, done that 3 times tonight, mentioned gas 6 times in her presentation, together with natural gas. Renewable and gas to take the place of coal. People generally accept the role of gas. Make no mistake, these renewable visions are gas and renewable visions. And gas is not natural gas. It is a high carbon fuel. It is going to drive up our emissions beyond our global budget. Lurking behind every renewable vision is a huge component of gas. I got to the point I got to by getting out of my fantasy zone about dealing with climate change and looking at cold, hard reality, and I didn't like the journey because I used to object to nuclear power. Please get serious with me on this journey and be honest and have a look at the information.
Thank you. Dr. Yoshida, I wonder if amongst the remarks you make you might mention what you think Japan's choice will be now. I mean, we've heard of the hot summers to come. Yeah. Will this be a renewable future for Japan, a gas future? How will you cope with your energy demands?
Well, I mean, the saving electricity is not so difficult. We have been accustomed to use plenty of electricity. Last year in Tokyo, we had saved electricity by 15% by just switching off TVs, other electric devices at home. 15%. It's not so difficult. And about the future of energy planning, we will have a declining population. In maybe 2 decades or 3 decades later, our population will go down below 100 million or so. So that's going to be a good saving for energy. And we can be more efficient. Without nuclear power plant, I think we will be able to survive in 2 decades or so. And in a big picture, nuclear issue and climate change issues. I think there is no risk-free world on this planet. We need to select risk. Well, from my viewpoint, I think the risk which exists potentially in the nuclear energy is much bigger than climate change, because the proliferation risk, nuclear terrorism risk, and the waste management risks, those are somewhat uncontrollable in the future for us. So, from my point of view, the climate adaptation to climate change is more controllable than those risks exist in the nuclear energy and the use of nuclear materials. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael Angwin, I'd ask you to reflect on Dr. Yoshida's comment in his opening remarks about the unthinkable actually occurring and the balance he's making there between what can be controlled for versus those sorts of risks. Can you address that as well when you make your closing remarks?
I'll try, but what I actually was going to say is that I welcome the fact that Dr. Yoshida pointed out that the main impact of Fukushima is likely to be psychological, which is not to underestimate it, but is to pinpoint what has to be managed and where you should direct your resources. Regarding Dominique, I think she and I actually agree that the future is a diverse portfolio of electricity generating technologies where I think we're arguing over what the shares are. Ian Lowe was apparently so confident of his argument that he barely made it. At one time he seemed to be saying he wanted to shut down the nuclear industry, and then he said he was misrepresented and he didn't, so I'm not quite sure what his position is. He spent most of his time, in fact, not making his argument but attacking us, and I reckon he'd give Tony Abbott a run for his money on the negativity stakes. Along the way, he misrepresented me by saying that I claimed that nuclear power was a sideshow, when in fact I didn't say that at all. But I'll give him credit. He's very good at his argument. I wanted to point out to you, as I've just done, how easy it is to make you laugh, how easy it is to establish a connection, how easy it is to go into a debate like this with a strategy and not have the argument but just try to make a connection with you, and that's what he did. And just to close, to rely upon the Beyond Zero Emissions report as your Bible for renewable energy, when here's a report which charts the course to the closure of the domestic aviation industry by 2020 and taking most of Australia's private vehicle off the road. So that's something which has no credibility at all.
Thank you. Dominique, a number of people with backgrounds in electrical engineering and power are really sceptical about the capacity of distributed networks and renewable energy. I know you've tried to address it. Is there something which you can say in your closing remarks that absolutely settles this as to why you're so confident it'll be an effective response?
Well, I don't have a background in electrical engineering, so I'm a bit at a disadvantage there. However, what I will say is that there are any number of electrical engineers that I've certainly spoken to. I mean, Mark Diesendorf is an expert in this area. For example, very confident that we are actually able to address the issue of variability in renewables. For example, in South Australia, we could be providing so much more electricity to the eastern states if we just invested in an interconnector between Victoria and South Australia. So, yes, it's expensive, of course, but there are initiatives that can be undertaken to address those issues. And again, it's about changing the way we use electricity, being able to predict the weather, basically, and the natural resources that provide renewable energy, and we will find that we actually can provide.
And is your future ultimately a gas future?
I think it's a fact that gas is a transitional fuel. I don't think there's any way to move beyond that. But the scenarios that I've tried to talk about today are ones that do meet a 2 degrees scenario, 450 parts per million. So yes, gas is a transitional fuel. I know for myself personally, in terms of the risks, I'd rather deal with the risks from gas than the risks from nuclear. And gas isn't ideal, of course. It still has emissions, but it's less than the coal. So for me personally, I think gas has got a very legitimate role to play. But in the long term, in the future, I suppose the time frame on future, I think that we will be able to have a system where it is 100% renewables, and we use electricity very wisely and conservatively, much more than we do so today.
Thank you. Danny, you have 2 minutes to make some closing remarks, answer any questions.
It's been a very interesting evening for me. It's probably not one that I ever anticipated I would be part of. When I hear the word gas, I think about coal seam gas, and I think about the way in which we're now absolutely determined to destroy some of the best land that Australia has. In our insatiable desire to actually keep our energy addiction going. We have heard really this evening that everything is a risk and a trade-off. And all I'm arguing for is, despite what Ian says about people having more education, as an educator he should be arguing for education, Education, understanding, getting the facts, but knowing what the compromise is that when we make it, when we make the decision, instead of saying, oh, that's okay, it's gas, it's natural, think about what we have to do to actually get it. What are the compromises? What are the actual challenges? What are the decisions that we're making to actually get that gas? What are we doing to the Hunter Valley? What are we doing to Australia in our central Queensland when we're destroying the countryside? So all I'm saying is, when you're thinking about these issues, think about them completely with all the facts, and not just do what we've done over the past 40 years, is say, well, that's fine, we've got plenty of coal, we'll be right, mate.
Thank you. And Professor Ian Lowe.
Thanks. I was asked, do we need both nuclear and renewables to slow climate change? And my answer is no. The transition is much more urgent than that. We don't have time to wait to build nuclear reactors. The report by Beyond Zero Emissions and the Institute of Energy at the University of Melbourne said if we were serious about it, we could get all of our energy from renewables with storage for when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine by 2020. Dr. Mark Diesendorf calculates that we could do it more cheaply than that report, but that report found the total cost of energy from now to 2050 about the same for a renewable future as for business as usual. I agree we shouldn't be sterilising cropland and digging up the Hunter Valley, but that's not driven by our insatiable demand for energy. That's driven by our insatiable demand for profits, because nearly all that coal seam gas and coal is for export rather than for Australian use. I thank not my old friend, but my friend of long standing, Martin Thomas, for reminding me of the Switkowski report, because it said nuclear energy is too slow. It would take 10 or 15 years to build one nuclear power station. It said it's too expensive. It would take a carbon price plus other subsidies to make nuclear power look economically attractive in Australia. And the fundamental point, I believe, is that it's too risky compared with wind or solar or biomass. Nobody worries about terrorists or rogue governments getting their hands on wind turbine blades or solar panels. And we know how to decommission wind turbines and solar panels at the end of their useful life with no risk to the community. I think the crucial question for you, the taxpayers, is why would you want to fund a slow, expensive and risky form of energy when there are cheaper, cleaner, safer alternatives? I've seen the future. It's a mix of efficiency and renewables. I think that's the future I want to see for my children.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I've got the results of your vote. Just a couple of things before I read them out. You may know that there's a debate coming up, I think in a couple of debates, on the topic that farmers should have the right to say no to miners, which will bring out this whole issue of land use, so that will be interesting. But the next debate, which is on the topic on the 31st of July, which will be in conjunction with the BBC World News, is on the topic that we have nothing to fear from a powerful China. And it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Speakers include Dr. Rizal Sukma, who is one of the leading thinkers on security and strategic issues coming in from Indonesia, and the head of the Australian Chamber of Commerce in China, and Dr. Michael Wesley, the head of the Lowy Institute. So it's going to be a very interesting debate and a great one for audience participation. A number of people to thank tonight: Deb Richards, who produces these debates, Chris Parker for managing event production, the staff and management of the City Recital Hall, volunteers who've done the poll which I'm about to reveal, the Mayor, Aldermen and officers of the City of Sydney who help us to put it on here at City Recital Hall, the Managing Director and staff of the ABC who are a fantastic media partner, and our supporters from AMP and Professional Public Relations. But before we even hear the results, so that your applause isn't conditioned by the outcome, let's just thank our marvellous panel of speakers: Ben Hurd, Michael Angwin, Danielle Ostelli, Fumihiko Yoshida, Dominic Lefebvre and Ian Lowe. Well done. Now, the result. I think I'd like to do an awards ceremony one day where I get to do this, and kind of read out the nominees. The pre-debate poll results. So it was really evenly divided. Against was 30.6%, undecided 34.3%, and for 35.1%. So you can see, hopefully you can see how much there was to fight for in terms of the arguments that were there. At the end of the debate, just talk amongst yourself. No, I just can't open the envelope properly. Okay, so the undecided had dropped right down to 16.8%. The against had gone from 30.6 to 31.6%, but winning the debate by a huge margin, by 51.4%. So, ladies and gentlemen, I declare the motion carried in the affirmative. I wish you all a very good night and declare the debate closed. Thank you.
This is Big Ideas from the ABC.